The Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. As a sergeant in the Imperial Guard, Bourgogne describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers, including brutal battles, extreme weather, and the struggle for survival during the retreat from Moscow. These are his words. "We found the burgomaster at the posting station in traveling dress. He wore a long coat lined with fine sheepskin, a fur cap, and boots of the same. His servant wore a sheepskin coat. I helped my brother the Cossack to mount, and as I was fastening on the portmanteau, I said softly, so as not to be heard, that should the opportunity offer, he must seize the burgomaster's horse and coat, and that of his servant as well, so that by means of these disguises we might escape. And that, in our present position, we must act promptly, as it meant life or death." We set off on our march, the servant in front as guide, I next, and between the two on horseback as a prisoner would. A little before the end of the village, we took a road to the left, and after a quarter of an hour's walking, we reached a little pine wood. While crossing it, I thought of putting my project into execution. After we had crossed the wood, I looked in front of me, and to right and left, looking out for anything likely to harm us. Seeing nothing, I strode to the burgomaster's side, and seizing the horse's bridle with one hand, and presenting a pistol with the other, I ordered him to dismount. As you may imagine, he was terribly taken aback. He looked at the Cossack as if to tell him to run me through the body. Meanwhile, the servant, with a great stick, rushed to knock me down, but without letting go of the horse's bridle, I struck him such a violent blow across the chest with the butt end of the pistol that I sent him sprawling yards off, and threatened to kill him if he made the slightest movement towards getting up. While this was happening, my brother told the burgomaster that he had better dismount, but he was so stupefied that the order had to be repeated several times. Finally, he dismounted, and I gave his animal to my brother to hold. Immediately, I took off the servant's boots, coat, and cap. Then, taking off my own cloak and coat and my cap, I threw them down on him, forcing him to put on the coat, so that in his turn he looked like the prisoner. Imagine the burgomaster's face at seeing his servant dressed up in such a fashion. But that was not all. Telling my brother, who had dismounted, to keep an eye on the servant, I effected a change of costume in his master, who at my invitation and without much trouble gave me his overcoat, boots and cap. I gave him in exchange my coat and his servant's cap. Then I made my brother put on the servant's coat and boots, and when he was completely attired and remounted and in a position to mount guard over our two prisoners, I dressed myself in my turn in the burgomaster's clothes. Mounting his horse, I took possession of his sword, and we set off at a gallop, leaving our two Prussians thunderstruck, and probably not knowing whether my brother was really a Cossack or not. We did not feel comfortable either, for although disguised, we were afraid of falling into the clutches of the Cossacks, of whom the burgomaster had spoken before our setting out. After advancing at a gallop for about 10 minutes, we reached a little village where the inhabitants, on seeing us, began shouting out, "Hurrah! Hurrah! Our friends the Cossacks! Hurrah!" They told us that our comrades had slept at a large village a quarter of a league away, and that they had left to cut off the French in their retreat before they should have reached the wood which intersected the route. They wanted to make us dismount and drink, but as we were not easy in our minds, we were satisfied with some glasses of schnapps without dismounting. Then my brother shouted, "Hurrah!" and we decamped, carrying off the bottle of schnapps, and accompanied by the hurrahs of the whole population. It might have been about 3 o'clock when we saw the wood in front of us and heard firing. A fight was going on between the French and the Russian cavalry, near a house on the borders of the road. So the peasants had not lied to us. The Cossacks had really intended to cut off the retreat of the column of stragglers before they could reach the wood. On seeing this, we set our horses to a gallop, and, without thinking of our resemblance to the Cossacks, we stationed ourselves along the road, in order to try and gain the entrance of the wood towards which the stragglers were rushing. They took us for Cossacks and ran faster. The Cossacks, on their side, taking us for some of themselves and thinking we were pursuing the French, came a dozen strong to support us and follow us into the wood. I had a Cossack to my right, my brother to my left, behind me the remaining Cossacks. Anyone would have thought I was their chief. The road was hardly wide enough to allow 3 horses to go abreast. After having trotted forward about 50 yards, we saw several of our officers barring the way with crossed bayonets and shouting to those in flight, "Don't mind these dogs, let them come on." I seized the opportunity here, and slackening my horse's pace, I slashed at the face of the Cossack to my right with my sword. He took another step and stopped, turning his head in my direction. But seeing that I was preparing to go on, he turned and escaped, bellowing. Those who were following did the same, and our horses imitated the movement, so that there we were, going in our turn after the Cossacks, who ran as if all the devils were after them. I caught sight of a road to the right with a Cossack in front of us. Seeing us, he slackened speed, stopped, and spoke to us in a language we did not understand. I hit him a violent blow on the head with my saber, which I believe would have severed it had it not been for the bearskin cap he wore. Astonished at this manner of reply, he made his escape, and being the better horseman, was soon out of sight. A quarter of an hour later, we had reached the other side of the wood. There was the Cossack again, who, seeing us, set off at a gallop, and we had no desire to follow him. We skirted the wood to its extremity. Afterwards, we maneuvered about till evening to find the right road, and we got here with much difficulty. "Now," concluded the sergeant, "we must rest a little and set off, for at daybreak we may have to be off again." On this we each of us settled down to take a little rest, while 6 men of the Kono garrison, soldiers in good condition, voluntarily offered to take a turn at watching at the door of the barn. We had not been resting an hour when we heard a shout, "Who goes there?" Directly afterwards, a man came in and fell down full length. Some of the men rose to help him. He was a gunner in the Imperial Guard who had been found at the bivouac I had missed. He had more than 20 wounds on his body, lance thrusts, and sword cuts. They asked for linen to bandage him with. I hastened to give one of my best shirts. The sergeant, one of the 2 brothers, made him swallow some drops of gin. The old chasseur gave some lint that he drew out of the depths of his bare skin. The wounded man was made more comfortable and settled as well as could be. Happily, his wounds were mainly on the back and head, a few on the right arm, but his legs were sound. I went up to ask him how he was. Almost before looking at me, he exclaimed, "It is you, sergeant. You were wise not to stay at the house by the wood where you had made up your mind to pass the night for a quarter of an hour after your departure. More than 400 Cossacks came up. We took up arms to defend ourselves, being then about 400 men. Seeing that we were ready to give them a reception, they halted. A detachment was formed, with an officer at their head, who advanced, telling us in good French to surrender. But a chasseur of the guard, named Michaud, the old cantinier's friend, left the ranks, and advancing so as to be heard by the Russian officer, "Tell me, you Lapin, how long have Frenchmen surrendered with arms in their hand? Come on, we are waiting for you." The officer instantly retired. They prepared to charge. We waited for them, and when they were about 25 yards off, half our men fired. Some of them fell. Then, thinking that we all had discharged our weapons and that we should not be able to reload, they advanced again, shouting and hurrahing, but they were met by another volley that put the greater number of their men hors de combat. At this they took to flight, and we thought we were rid of them, but 5 minutes later they returned in greater numbers, and just at the moment when we were retreating to the wood, not having had again time to reload, We were overcome by the blows of lance and sword. Almost all were killed or wounded. I remained on the ground wounded and pretending to be dead, and finding myself on the edge of a ditch bordering the road, I rolled into it. The peasants came up and set to work to despoil the dead and wounded, accompanied by some Cossacks whose horses had been killed. I was lucky enough to escape notice, and when they had withdrawn, raising myself with difficulty, I gained the wood and crossed it. And finally, my friends, I am so lucky as to have met you. But what is to become of me? "We will lead you," replied the soldiers of the garrison. "And I," said the sergeant brother, "will lend you my horse." In spite of the sleep which overwhelmed me, I began to think of setting off, for not being strong, I took a great deal of time to go a very little way. A young soldier offered to accompany me if I wanted to set out at once. I accepted his offer, especially as this young man, who had suffered nothing, was strong and would be able to help me. And so we took our departure. We entered a wood through which the road lay. Here the soldier, who was unarmed, wished to carry my gun. I gave it up to him, as, in my feeble condition, he was better able to make use of it than I. After walking, I do not know how long, supported by my young companion's arm, for I often doze while marching, we reached the extremity of the wood. It might have been about 4 o'clock in the morning, December 16th. We walked on, haphazard, for about another half hour. Very luckily the moon rose. But with it came a high wind, and so fine a snow, that it cut our faces and prevented our seeing before us. I suffered greatly from the longing to sleep, and without the help of the little soldier who held me all the time by the arm, I should certainly have fallen down sleeping. My companion pointed out to me a large group of buildings some way in front. I saw it was a posting station, and concluded from that we had gone about 3 leagues. In a quarter of an hour's time we had reached the doors. Entering, I threw myself down near a fire. There were several left by the soldiers, almost all of the Imperial Guard who had marched on to Villebalen. Some gunners also of the guard were still there, but getting ready to leave. I had slept peacefully for about 10 minutes when I felt myself shaken by the arm. I tried to resist, but someone raised me by my shoulders. I awoke at last, and heard a shout coming from an old gunner. "The Cossacks! Get up, my boy! Courage a little longer!" 11 Cossacks had come to a standstill, and were probably only awaiting our departure to come and take our places. "Come," said the gunner. "We must give up the position and beat a retreat on Villebalen. We have only another league, so come, let us be off." We had to take to the road again. There were 6 of us, 4 gunners, the little soldier and myself. We left the barn. It was December 16th, the 59th day's march since leaving Moscow. The wind was high and the cold terrible. All at once, in spite of all that my comrade could do to hold me, I sank down, overcome with sleep and fatigue. The efforts of my companion and 2 gunners were necessary to get me on my feet, although when there I was still asleep. I awoke, however, when a gunner rubbed my face with snow. Then he made me swallow a little brandy. That pulled me together a little. They each took an arm, and so made me walk much faster than I could have done alone. It was in this way that I reached Villebalen. On entering the town, we learned that King Murat was in it, with all the remnant of the Imperial Guard. In spite of the great cold, there was plenty of bustle going on in the town on the part of the soldiers, who were in hopes of buying bread and brandy from the numerous Jews in the place. At the door of each house, too, there was a sentinel, and whenever anyone presented himself for admission, he was answered that some general lodged there or some colonel, or that there was no more room. We were told by others to go and look for our own regiment. The gunners found some comrades of their own and went off with them. I was beginning to be in despair when I was told by a peasant that in the first street to the left there were only a few people. We went there, but always found a sentinel at every door and everywhere the same response. I saw for myself that inside the houses the men were heaped up on one another. However, we could not remain very long in the street without dying of cold. It would be difficult to express how much I suffered on this day from cold, but still more from disappointment at seeing myself repulsed everywhere, and that too by comrades. At last I spoke to a grenadier who told me there were people everywhere, but ill will and selfishness as well, and that no attention must be paid to the houses being sentineled, that one must go in. For I see, he continued, that you are in a bad way. Making a sign to my comrade to follow me, I turned to enter the first house I came to. An old fellow barred the way with his musket, saying that it was the colonel's quarters and that there was no more room. I answered that, even were it the emperor's lodging, there would have to be room for two, and that I should go in. Just then, I caught sight of another grenadier busy fastening a pair of officer's epaulettes onto the shoulder of his overcoat. To my great surprise, I recognized Picard, my old companion, whom I had not seen since leaving Wilna on December 6th. Instantly, I said, "Tell Colonel Picard that Sergeant Bourgogne is asking him for room." "You are mistaken," he answered. But without listening to him, I forced my way past the sentry, the other followed me, and we entered. No sooner did Picard recognize me than he threw his big epaulettes onto the straw, exclaiming, "Jour de Dieu! It is mon pays, my sergeant! How is it that you are alone? Have you been in the rear guard?" Without replying, I let myself fall upon the straw, exhausted with fatigue, want of sleep, and hunger, and suffocated as well with the heat of a great stove. Picard ran to his knapsack, brought out a bottle of brandy, and made me swallow a few drops, which brought me round a little. Then I begged him to let me rest. It might have been about 8 o'clock in the morning. It was 2 in the afternoon when I awoke. Picard placed between my knees a little earthen plate of soup with rice, which I ate with pleasure, looking meanwhile all round me, trying to collect my thoughts. Finally, everything became clear to me so that I could remember all that had happened during the last 24 hours. Picard broke into my reflection to tell me all that had happened to him since we were separated at Wilna. After having driven away the Russians, who showed themselves on the height of Wilna, we were brought back to the square. From there, we were led to the suburb on the Kono road, to act as guard to King Murat, who had just left the town. There I looked round for you, thinking you had followed, and was astonished not to see you. At midnight, we had to set out for Kono, to accompany Murat and Prince Eugène, who also was lodged in the suburb. But on reaching the foot of the mountain, we found it impossible to cross it on account of the quantity of snow and the number of carriages and wagons along the road. When the day had broken, the king and prince, by making a sweep around the mountain, succeeded in continuing on their way. But I and many others, having no horses, began to climb the road again. Lucky for us, for we had the opportunity to monter à la roue and make a few 5-franc pieces. At your service, you hear, Montpays. Picard gave me the details of his journey up to the moment when chance had brought about our meeting. I then told him that every time I met him, it gave me the same pleasure, but that this time I was especially pleased at finding him a colonel. He began to laugh, telling me it was a ruse de guerre which he had played to get a good lodging. He had appointed himself colonel the day before and was recognized as such by those about him, who showed him all respect. Picard told me that at 3 o'clock a review was to be held by Murat when orders would be given, telling the remnants of the different corps the places at which they were to meet. I decided to go so as to meet my comrades there. Picard shaved me with a blunt razor that we had found in the kit of the Cossack killed on November 23rd. It was my first shave since leaving Moscow, and although he ground the razor on his scabbard and then passed it over his hand to give it an edge, he nonetheless rasped my face. At the appointed hour, we left our lodging to repair to the rendezvous. The muster was to take place in a larger street. Soldiers of all ranks and regiments came. Several of the veterans of the guard, to draw attention to themselves, had dressed themselves as if for grand parade. To see them, one would have thought they had come from Paris rather than from Moscow. At the rendezvous, I had the luck to meet all those with whom I had been on the preceding day, as well as a good many others whom I had not seen since leaving Wilna, but our numbers had diminished. Grandier said to me, "I hope you will not leave us again. You must come to our quarters. And as we are allowed to make use of sledges or carts to travel in, we will try to find one." We stopped in the street a long time waiting for King Murat. Meanwhile, there were many surprises at meeting friends. In finding those living whom one had long thought dead, I had the pleasure of meeting Sergeant Humblot, with whom I had been traveling the evening before, and from whom I had been separated in the wood at the time of the Cossack attack. I learned also that the cantinière, Marie and Mother Gâteau, had got into good quarters. As Murat did not come, the names of those men unable to work were taken, these to be dispatched the next day at 6 o'clock in the morning on sledges furnished by the authorities. We could not find one for ourselves, however, and had to comfort ourselves by preparing to pass a good night, so as to be fit to march the following day. Picard had said that he wanted to speak to me before we separated. Hardly was the order for departure given when I felt a smart tap on my shoulder. I turned and saw Picard. He made a sign to me and Grandier also to follow him. And when we had moved away a little, he said, "You are going to do me the kindness of accepting a good pull of white wine, Rhine wine." "Is it possible?" I exclaimed. For only answer, he said, "Follow me." He then told us that the evening before he had made the acquaintance of a Jew with the idea of selling him things he wanted to dispose of, his Cornell's epaulets, for instance. And as he had been often taken for a Jew, he passed himself off as one, saying that his mother was the daughter of the rabbi at Strasbourg, and that he was called Salomon. The Jew was delighted at the hope of making a good bargain and had pointed out to him his house, assuring him that he would find some good Rhine wine there. We went to the back of the synagogue. To one side was a little house where Picard stopped. He looked all round to see if anyone was there. Then, pinching his nose, he called out in a nasal voice, "Jacob! Jacob!" At a barred opening, we saw a figure appear in a long fur cap and adorned with a dirty beard. Recognizing Picard, he said to him in German, "Ah, my dear Salomon, it is you. I will open the door." We entered a very warm room, stinking and disgusting. As soon as we were seated on a bench around the stove, we saw 3 other Jews who, Jacob said, constituted his family. Picard, who knew how to go to work with his pretended co-religionists, began by opening his knapsack and drawing out, to begin with, a pair of epaulettes, not a colonel's, but a field marshal's, and a parcel of lace stripes, the whole of it new, picked up on the Wilna mountain out of the deserted wagons. There were also some silver covers that had come from Moscow. The Jews opened their eyes wide. Picard now asked for wine and bread. Some excellent Rhine wine was brought. The bread was not exactly of the same quality, but just then it was better than one could have hoped for. While we were drinking, the Jews were inspecting the articles spread out upon the bench. Jacob asked Picard how much he wanted for all that. "Name it yourself," answered Picard. The Jew mentioned a price very far from what Picard wanted. He said, "No!" Jacob went a little higher. This time Picard, on whom the wine was beginning to take effect, looked at the Jew sneeringly and answered him by laying a finger on the side of his nose and humming the rabbi's chant in the synagogue on the Sabbath. The 4 Jews began to rock like Chinamen and chant verses. Grandier looked at Picard, thinking he was tipsy, and I, in spite of my sufferings, was almost dying of laughter. At last Picard stopped singing to pour us out some drink. Meanwhile, the Jews talked together about the price of the articles. Jacob offered a still higher price, but it was not yet as much as Picard wanted, so he recommenced his chant, till finally a bargain was concluded on condition that he received gold. Jacob paid Picard in Prussian gold pieces. He was probably satisfied with his bargain, for he gave us nuts and onions. The wine had gone to our heads, for when Picard received his money we began to perform the Sabbath like him. This charivari would have gone on a long time if there hadn't been a knocking at the door made by the buttons of muskets. Jacob looked through the grating and saw several soldiers who told him they were billeted on him and that if he didn't open at once, the door would be beaten in. He opened directly. We made up our mind to retire, and I said goodbye to Picard with a promise to meet again at Elbing, the place to which we were under orders to march. On reaching our lodging, we had some rice bouillon. Then I attended to my feet and shoes and stockings, and as we were in a warm room and on fresh straw, I soon fell asleep. That concludes the 22nd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.